What's up everyone? In this video we will talk about specificity, and before I start explaining what specificity is, let's give an example and see if you can predict what background color of an element is going to be. So let's give a quick overview of what we have in the code. So in our HTML we have an article and it has the following attributes. It has an ID attribute of a value of article ID, class attribute with a value of article class, and it also has inline styles with a background color of blue. And also inside of the article we have h1 and the P with some Latin. Inside of our style CSS, we have three CSS rules. We have article selector and we have ID selector of article ID, and we also have the class selector. And on the right hand side in the browser, we just have our HTML loaded without any styles. And notice our article element has inline styling. And in the very first video, we covered why inline styling is the least preferable option for writing our CSS. And this is going to be the reason why. So let's go ahead and refresh our page, and the background color of our article is actually going to be blue. So if you answered that the background color is going to be blue, you're right. Inline styling is hard to override due to very high specificity, and more on that in a second. Let's remove our inline styling and work with just our CSS. So I'm gonna go ahead and delete the inline styling from our article element. And now let's go back to our CSS and notice that every CSS rule is targeting our article element. Over here, we have an element selector that's targeting our article element. We have an ID selector that's also targeting the article element. It has an ID attribute of article ID and a class selector. The article element inside of our HTML also has a class attribute with a value of article class. So which one is going to win? Is it the one in the bottom or the one at the top? Well, if we refresh the page, it's actually going to be the one in the middle, the ID selector. And the reason for that is ID selector has the highest specificity out of those three. So, as you can see, due to specificity, your code might not behave the same way as you would like. Basically, specificity is a weight that's being applied to your CSS declarations. And the way that this weight is calculated is based on how many different types of selectors you have in your CSS rule. And you can think of specificity weight as a point-based system. Let's take a look at the comment over here, and let me just make that a little bit bigger so we can fit everything on the screen. Cool. And I want you to pay attention to this part over here. And what we have over here is a table that basically explains how CSS specificity is being calculated. So we have a simple table and we have three columns. First column is going to be the amount of ID selectors that you have in your CSS rule. The second column is going to be the amount of class selectors, pseudo classes, and attribute selectors that you have in your CSS rule. And the last column is going to be how many element selectors you have. And if you take a look at the example right below the table over here, we can see that the first CSS rule has the following specificity, 0, 0, 1. And the reason for that is because this CSS rule has 0 ID selectors, it has 0 class selectors, pseudo classes, or attribute selectors, but it has 1 element selectors, which is article. So in this case, this CSS rule will have 0, 0, 1 specificity. 0 corresponds to the first column, the second 0 corresponds to the second column, and the 1 corresponds to the amount of element selectors that this CSS rule has, which is 1. And if we take a look at the second example over here, we have 0 ID selectors, we have 1 class selectors over here, dot some class. It could be any class, it doesn't belong to our HTML or it doesn't relate to our HTML at all. And it also has 0 element selectors. So the specificity of this CSS rule is going to be 0, 1, 0. And one thing that I'd like to point out is even if our CSS rule has specificity of 0, 0, 100, it will still be dominated by 0, 1, 0. And the reason for that is because this selector has a greater value in the second column than 0, 0, 100. Thus, this selector will win. And same goes to CSS rule with a specificity of 1, 0, 0. In this case, we have 1 in the first column, which is greater than 0 in the first column over here. So this CSS specificity is going to win over 0, 1, 0. So let's go ahead and use our code and calculate specificity. So if we take a look at the first CSS rule with the article selector or with the element selector, let's calculate the specificity of that. So how many ID selectors we have? 0. So we can write 0 in the first column. And I'm just going to write it as a comment. And how many class selectors or pseudo classes or attribute selectors we have? Well, 0. So we'll write 0 in the second column. And how many element selectors we have? Well, it's going to be 1. So the specificity of this CSS rule is going to be 001. Now let's go ahead and do the exact same thing for the next one. Well, over here, what we have is we have 1 ID selector, 0 class selectors, and 0 element selectors. And we have the exact same, well, not the exact same specificity, but the exact same ID over here. We have 0 ID selectors, 1 class selector, and 0 element selector. So in this case, the ID selector is going to win with a specificity of 100. And another thing I'd like to point out is if you're using VS Code, you can actually hover over your CSS rule and it will actually give you that selector specificity of 100. So if you're not sure what your specificity is, you can hover over it in your coding editor and it will most likely give you the answer. But what happens if I actually bring back our inline styling? Well, in this case, if I refresh the page, it will still be blue. And this is because if there is an inline styling on the element, it will win over all other selectors. This is exactly why you don't want to use it. It will be very hard to overwrite. So let's go ahead and remove the inline styling. And another thing that I want to mention is I'm just going to remove these comments over here and comment the whole thing out. And the thing that I wanted to mention was what happens if two selectors have the exact same specificity. So in this case, what happens if we have something like this? We have an article with a background color of light green, and we have another selector, the exact same one, that has a background color of red, for example. What happens in this case? Both of the selectors have a specificity of 001, as you can see. So if we refresh the page, what's going to happen is the bottom one will win. Now let's take a look at more complex example when we use CSS combinators. And combinators don't increase the specificity in any way. So if we use a descendant combinator like so, let's go ahead and use it over here on the second one, it won't increase the specificity. But now let's calculate the specificity of this selector or this selector. Well, how many element selector we have in this case? Well, we have body, which is 1, and we have article. So the specificity is going to be 002. And in this case, we have article with specificity of 001. Well, this is going to be greater. Thus, the background color is going to be red. So if you refresh again, nothing is going to change because the body article selector is going to have greater specificity. Now let's go ahead and comment this portion out and we'll use a different example using classes. So I'm going to bring back this comment and let's uncomment this part, just remove some extra spaces. And now let's take a look at this example. So which one is going to win in this case? Well, in the first case, we have two classes. We have a class selector and we have a pseudo class. So on line 42, the specificity is going to be 0, 2, 0. On line 46, we use descendant selectors. So we have one element selector and one class selector. So the specificity is going to be 0, 1, 1. On line 50, we have something that you're not used to seeing. We don't have the space over here. And what this means is basically it will target an article with an article class. And if you hover over it, you're going to get an example from VS Code. So it will say that you're targeting an element article with a class of article class. And in this case, since we use element selector in combination with the class selector, the specificity is going to be 0, 1, 1. So if we were to refresh the page, now it's going to be green. And the reason for that is because this selector on line 42 has a greater specificity. It has a specificity of 0, 2, 0. And the one on the 46 has 0, 1, 1. And this one has also 0, 1, 1. Thus, the line 42 will win and the background color of an article is going to become green. So let's go ahead and comment this part out and we'll move on to the next example. And in the next example, what we're going to cover is something that's really dangerous, and that's going to be the important rule. And let me just buy some space over here. If you take a look over here, we have on line 67, we have an element selector, but on line 68, look at this property background color. for the value of that property, at the end we have that exclamation mark important, and this is going to be our important rule that is super dangerous to use. And in this case, that's pretty much going to be the exact same code that we have over here, plus an element selector with an important rule. And notice how everything is going to shift. You might think that the element selector in this case is going to have a specificity of 001, which is true, but with important rule, it will actually overwrite everything. So it will be super important, and when you say important for the particular property, it will pretty much overwrite all other styles on an element. And even if we bring back our inline styles and save it and refresh the page, you can see that it won't turn blue. And the reason for that is because we have important on line 68. It will actually overwrite all other CSS declaration that we have. And the last thing I want to mention is that specificity will only matter when two rules try to use the same property. So let's demo it. So I'm gonna go ahead and comment out this portion. I'm gonna remove the inline styling from our article element for the last time, and let's go ahead and refresh the page. And now let's use the following. So I'm gonna use the article ID as a selector, and inside of here I'm just gonna say background color of red. And for the next one, I'm actually going to use the element selector, and I'm gonna say background color of, let's go with blue. And I'm also gonna give the text color, and I'm gonna say color, let's go with yellow. So what's going to happen in this case? Well, in this case, we're targeting article element in two CSS rules, but over here with ID selector, we're targeting and changing the background color to be red, and on line 75 with that element selector, we're changing the background color to be blue, as well as the color of the text to be yellow. So we only have one conflicting property, and that's going to be the background color. But the color yellow, which changes the text color of an element, is not conflicting with anything. And even though the specificity of the element selector is less than the specificity of the ID selector, the color property is not going to be conflicting. In this case, if I refresh the page, I'm actually going to see that the background color of the article is going to be red, while the color of the text is going to be yellow. So if properties are not conflicting, both of them will be applied, like in this example. And this is going to be it for this video. And in the next video, we're going to talk about positioning in CSS. So stay tuned, and I'll catch you later.